Poverty is the mother of all crime. Marcus Aurelius. Injustice is the mother of all crime. Jean Paul Sartre. What does this tell us about crime? Well, first, it tells us that crime has two lesbian parents, but secondly, it tells us that there are many factors that lead individuals to commit crime. What I've tried to do with this video is condense 4 years of criminology into 1 hour. Now, this video, number one, isn't going to be an hour long, it's going to be slightly more than that. And number two, it's definitely not going to condense all that education down into an hour, but I've tried my best to get all the fundamentals laid out. Now, I've sectioned this video off into different chapters, so if you're only interested in victims or punishments or whatever aspect of criminology you're interested in, you can just watch that short section and get on with your day. If you're here for the long run, then buckle in. This is going to be a long video. Before we begin, I want to create two definitions for the two different kinds of justice. To do this, we actually have to define another word, that one being fair. Now, I have a pretty good definition for fair, or if you will, a pretty fair definition for fair. See what I did there? Pretty witty, huh? Okay, let's move on. The definition I have for fair is the proper outcome for an action in regards to morality. Now, what does that really mean? It sounds kind of like a Jordan Peterson quote, right?
The question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen?
Let me give you a pretty intuitive outline for it. If someone does something that is moral, good, they deserve a benefit. This is because morality is linked to society thriving, so it should be rewarded with a benefit. If someone does something that is immoral, they deserve a detriment. That's because immorality is bad for society and should be punished. If someone does something that is amoral, that is nothing at all, they deserve no benefit nor detriment because they have not changed the status quo, so why should their status quo change? Unfortunately, we don't live in a fair world. Oftentimes, immoral actions lead to benefits. For example, if I stole $500 from you, that would be an immoral action, and yet here I am with the benefit of $500. That completely destroys the cool diagram we just made. I did something bad and I got a benefit. In the same way, you did something amoral, you didn't do anything, and you got a detriment for it. That also ruins the diagram. So how do we fix that? Well, we can use two different kinds of justice to set things right. The first kind of justice is enacted on me, and that's retributive justice. Now, because I did something that was immoral, I deserve a detriment. This can be anything from prison time to paying a fine to anything else that is bad for me. The second kind of justice we're going to use is restorative justice, which is enacted on the victim. Because they did something that was amoral, nothing, they should have no change to their status quo. And so all we have to do is reinstate that status quo. This can be simply done by just giving them back their $500. We'll be referencing this type of justice in the future, as crime is usually anything that disrupts this fair balance. What is criminology? Well, criminology can be broken down into two parts. Crimin, which means crime, and ology, which means the study of. Put those two phrases together and you get crime, the study of. I don't know what that means, but that's the best I got. In reality, criminology is the study of crime and deviant behavior. It's a social science, like psychology or sociology. It's dedicated to the pursuit of understanding what crime is, how do we combat it, and why do people commit it. Criminology is interdisciplinary, which means it pulls from multiple different sciences and social sciences to create a holistic view of crime. Here are a couple fields now. Philosophy, to understand what crime is and how do you punish it. Economics, to understand how financial status influence individuals to commit crime. Let's say you live in a country where 1% of people own 99% of the wealth. I know that's a crazy hypothetical, it would never happen, but let's just pretend like it did. Individuals in these societies would probably grow to be bitter and envious of these people with all the wealth, and commit crime as ways to get back at them. Sociology, to understand how groups and societies influence individuals to commit crime. Let's say you're in a gang, or, grew up in Portland. Psychology, to understand what behavior or experiences influence individuals to commit crime. This means that if you had like a brother or a father that was in the crime business, you would probably get into it yourself as you saw that was normal. Biology, to understand how does brain structure or other biological aspects influence crime. Now, we'll be looking at brain structure a lot to understand how antisocial personality disorder or borderline personality disorder influence individuals to commit crime. What we won't be doing a lot of is understanding other biological aspects. In the criminological theory section, I give a couple theories that try to explain how certain biological features make you more prone to commit crime. Although, fair warning, these are very racist theories made by racist people, so prepare yourself. Anthropology, to understand how do various cultures understand crime. History, to understand what actions in the past were considered a crime that should not have been, like, being gay. and vice versa, understand what actions should have been considered crimes that really weren't. Say, the treatment of women. You like that transition? That was pretty cool, huh? It was the Law and Order transition, and this is on like criminology, so it's like, kind of cool. I won't be doing that transition ever again. I'm sorry. Criminology began in Europe in the 1760s. Now, of course, the idea of crime and how do we punish it began much, much earlier in history, but the actual founding of the social science of criminology was in Italy and England at this time. In Italy, Cesare Beccari, I'm going to mess up a lot of these names, okay? I need you to give me a break on it. He was an Italian philosopher, and he wrote a book on crime and punishment. No, not that. Crime and Punishment. It's a much lamer book, but, still give it to him. In this book, he argued that punishment should be proportional to the crime committed. In Britain, Jeremy Bentham contended that the justice system should be utilitarian, maximizing happiness for the majority. He created a blueprint for a new type of prison called the
panopticon.
This type of prison allowed guards to watch prisoners without the prisoners knowing if they were being watched or not. This meant that prisoners would almost always act good because they didn't want to be caught. Years later, in the United States, the NSA would shamelessly steal this tactic and implement it on every person's laptop. Entering the 1800s, positivism began to invade the criminology field. We'll be discussing positivism more later, but for now, all you need to understand is that positivism was a school of thought that said criminals were not responsible for their actions and should be rehabilitated, not punished. As time passed, criminology continued to evolve with new theories and schools of thought popping up to explain why criminals exist. There, you like that transition? Really simple. Not a big deal. Because you hated the other one so much. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Back to the, what was this second called? Oh, yeah, it's probably an important section. What is crime? There are really two key types of crime. Those that violate natural law and those that violate man-made law. Crimes that violate natural law are bad in and of themselves, like murder or theft. Whereas crimes that violate man-made law could lead to something else that's bad, like how driving without car insurance is illegal, even though there's no direct harm it causes. Because if you get into an accident, there's a chance you cannot pay the person you hit. In other words, man-made laws only exist to better regulate or prevent natural law violations. But saying crime is something that violates natural law is only begging the question, what is natural law? Okay, I just want to interrupt here to vent some frustrations. I read like 3, well, I guess it was more like 4 or 5 actually. It doesn't matter. I read a bunch of textbooks basically, and they all, gave me this definition of natural law violations, right? And I was like, oh, cool, what is natural law? And they're like, well, we all know what natural law is. It's murder and theft. And I was like, well, not everybody agrees that those things are wrong, but they wouldn't really tell me what it was. And so I don't think this section is really necessary. I just wanted to add this part to tell you why I was upset. So how do you make something a crime? Well, of course it requires passing a law against it, but what are the criteria it has to meet to pass that law? We're not going to get into the legal nitty-gritty. I'm talking more like the philosophical side of what should it meet. The first criteria is, does it cause harm, either physically or mentally, to yourself or others? Now, of course, we know about things that cause harm that aren't illegal, say lying or cheating on your wife, or husband, of course. Why aren't these things illegal? Well, that's because they really don't meet the second criteria, which is it able to be regulated? Now, about a couple months ago, I had a friend that was walking home from work, and he got assaulted by some guy. I really don't know why. This guy just ran up to him, punched him, and then ran away, so it was kind of weird. But that being said, he called the cops, and he was like, hey, some guy just assaulted me. And they were like, well, I'm sorry, we don't really have the manpower to help you. Now, this is an important point. Currently, most police stations don't have the manpower to hunt down people that have committed criminal actions. How are we going to hunt down people that lie or cheat on their wife? How are we going to prosecute them in court? The evidence needed for that is much, much harder and much more eyewitness-based. It's for this reason that many of these crimes are not illegal. So you're probably thinking, Theo, if something is harmful and it is able to be regulated, it should be illegal, right? Nope, wrong. I can't believe you said that. You look dumb. No, of course not. There's one last criteria we have to see if it checks. For this, I want to draw a comparison. Last night I was on Twitter and I read something that said, Obama hates Blue's Clues. And I was so mad, and I was like, man, I can't believe I voted for Obama when I was like 12 years old. How could I? I wish I could go back in time and change that. I started sending multiple messages to Obama, talking about how much I hated him, how much I never liked him. Then I blocked him on Twitter, because I never wanted to see that man again in my life. Later that night, I figured out that was all a sham. It was misinformation. Obama actually does like Blue's Clues. He released an official statement on it. I was like, oh, well, that sucks. That caused me harm. It caused Obama a lot of harm. And it's not that hard to regulate misinformation on social media. So, it should be illegal, right? No. Have you read 1984? That's a real book. That really happened. You know why it happened? Because we gave the government too much power. Now, I don't want to let the libertarian side of me out too much. This isn't supposed to be a highly political video. However, I do think it's pretty common consensus that we shouldn't give the government too much power. Allowing the government to dictate what right and wrong is means that they're going to say that some things are wrong when they are actually right. Let's say I get on Twitter and say, hey guys, isn't it weird that that one president said there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and then we went there and there's no weapons of mass destruction? Kind of makes you wonder what we were doing there, right? What if the government says, that's not true, wrong, Theo, you're going to jail for 5 years, right? That's bad, that's dangerous. We should have free speech. We should be able to criticize the government. And once we give the government the ability to decide what is right and what is wrong, even if it's harmful for society, even if it's able to regulate it, it's still bad to give them that power. And so it doesn't pass the third criteria. With these three criteria in place, let's look at some common crimes. Now, I looked at a lot of textbooks. Like I said, I'm going to continue bragging about this the entire video, okay? I think it's impressive. I didn't really read the textbooks. I looked at the pictures, but the pictures were cool, okay? And I found a long list of different ways to categorize crime. I picked my favorite one. I'm not even going to lie. There was no real method to decide which one I should choose because they're all different. But I picked my favorite one. And, well, let's go through it. There are really 4 categories of crime. Violent crime, property crime, white-collar crime, and narcotics. Under violent crime, there are crimes like homicide, assault, sexual assault, really anything that harms the human body. Next up is property crimes. This is anything that really damages property, such as theft. Of course, if I take property away from you, you don't have that property is now damaged. But it also includes such things as vandalization or arson. The next crimes I want to talk about are what I call the funny crimes. These are the white-collar crimes. They include embezzlement, tax evasion, price fixing, and of course, money laundering. I don't even have to tell you what money laundering is. We all watch Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad, they made narcotics in that. Speaking of narcotics, that's our next category. Boom. Great transition. Narcotics. There are 3 really categories of what is illegal. That is producing narcotics, unless you're a pharmaceutical company. You sell narcotics, or, of course, the most important one, if you use narcotics. We really got to punish those people that are addicted to drugs. How terrible of them. Bad people. There are many other ways to categorize crime, many other different subsets you can do for it. So below I linked these categories of crime if you want to look more into it. All right. I was kind of upset with the last transition because it felt kind of lame, like PowerPoint presentation. So I really went all out on that one. Did you like it? Please say you liked it, because I really worked hard on that. That was like an hour of work. Anyways, this one is victimology. We're going to play a fun game. It's called, what do you think victimology is? I'll give you a second to think about it, okay? Victimology. If you guessed the study of victims, great job. You're a genius. I don't know how you figured that one out. Victimology is an important subset of criminology. It focuses on victims in order to establish restorative justice for them. See? Restorative justice? I talked about that before. Now, there are really 3 key consequences of crime on victims. The first one is very simple, financial. If I steal $500 from you, you now don't have $500. Real straightforward. Now, how do I set up restorative justice in this case? How do I reestablish the status quo? Well, it's really simple, actually. I give you your $500 back. The second one is unfortunately not as straightforward. It's psychological consequences. Trauma is often associated with crime. If I rob you at gunpoint for your money and then just give back the money I stole, that's not going to undo the psychological trauma I've given you. Feelings of fear or vulnerability may stay with you for a very long time. So to create restorative justice in this case is much harder. The best thing that the justice system can do is give you therapy or other mental health aid, but this doesn't really guarantee that the wound will ever heal. Finally, there's one last consequence of crime. This one might be even harder to solve than the last. That is the social consequence of it. The social consequence is an interesting one, because it is all of our faults for it existing. To use an example, think about a man that has been raped. Oftentimes, these victims are seen as emasculated, or weak, and shamed by others. This can actually be seen firsthand in, oh my god, in the amazing diss track, The Heart Part 6 by Drake. In the song, though, he actually uses the social consequence in which he tries to shame Kendrick for being molested as a kid. Now, of course, this was a terrible angle to go for a diss track, but it does show us how sometimes victims can be shamed for something that has happened to them. So how do we set up restorative justice in this case? Well, it's really impossible to do for one victim at a time. Instead, we have to create an entire cultural change. This is done simply by reframing how we think about victims. In fact, victim is a great example, as we change using that label to survivor instead for those that have been sexually abused. This cultural change is very important to getting rid of the social consequence and setting up restorative justice for it. Another key aspect of victimology is identifying risk or protective factors. Risk factors is anything that makes it more likely for a crime to happen to you, say drinking at a party or walking home late at night. Protective factors is anything that makes it less likely for a crime to happen to you, say walking around with a gun on your hip or having security cameras installed in your house. Of course, when we study protective and risk factors, it's very important we don't blame the victim for it. We don't go up to them and say, you should have done X, Y, Z, or this wouldn't have happened to you. Instead, we just simply identify them and share the information to minimize the amount of victims that exist. There's one last aspect of victimology, and that is understanding why some victims refuse to report crimes that happened against them. Victimology also observes the penal couple, which is the relationship between the victim and the criminal, to understand how that affects the likelihood of a crime being reported. Victims are extremely likely to report a crime if the perpetrator was a stranger, but if the perp was a friend or romantic partner, victims are more inclined to keep the crime a secret, which is why long-term domestic abuse cases are so common. Alright, genius, you figured out what victimology is, so now tell me, what is criminal etiology? If you look at the chapter name, it's just going to give you the answer, so please don't do it. Criminal etiology is the study of why do people commit crimes. This is a big question in criminology. Probably one of the biggest, actually, and there's many schools of thought and theories that try to explain why. Now, quickly, the difference between schools of thought and theories, because I did not know the difference. Schools of thought are just a general framework for a group of theories, pulling them all together in one concise perspective. First, we're going to look at all the criminological theories, and then we're going to look at the schools of thought they belong to. Gee, explaining a bunch of theories in a short amount of time. How will I do this? Boom! Bet you didn't see this one coming? That's right. Generic YouTube slop, baby. You thought I was going to do something creative with this? Nah, I'm going to do this in the most bland style ever. Welcome to Every Criminological Theory Explained in 8 Minutes. Anomy theory. This theory states that the breakdown of social norms and values lead to social instability and deviant behavior. Atavism theory. Atavism is a biological function which occurs whenever a genetic trait from an ancestor reappears in a descendant seemingly out of nowhere. For example, if a snake was born with legs. This theory uses atavism to explain criminals by saying they are devolved human beings that can be identified by their primitive features. Does that sound racist to you? Well, I wonder why, because the guy that came up with this theory was eugenist, aka a Nazi. Biosocial theory. This theory explains that crime and antisocial behavior is caused by both biological factors and environmental factors. In other words, criminals are shaped by nature and nurture. Broken window theory. This theory posits that any signs of disorder or neglect, such as a broken window, can lead to an increase in crime. Concentric zone theory. This theory breaks down cities into multiple different rings, with the center of the city being the industrial zone and the ring around it being the working class zone. As cities expand, the industrial center will bleed into the working class zone, creating a new zone called the zone of transition, which is characterized by social disorganization and instability. Like anomy theory, this theory states that this instability will lead to increase in crime. Conflict theory. This theory holds that crime results from the conflicts in society among the different social classes, and that laws actually arise from necessity as a result of this conflict, rather than genuine consensus. This theory is mostly attributed to Karl Marx, as he explains that the bourgeoisie create laws to keep the proletariat working class down. Control balance theory. This theory suggests that individuals with control imbalance, either too much control over others or too little control over their own lives, are more likely to engage in deviant behavior. For example, those that are poor, much more likely to commit crime as they see society as unfair and so there's nothing wrong with them doing something that is unfair. At the same time, those that are very rich are much more likely to commit both white-collar crimes and, as we all know from Hollywood, very sexually deviant crimes as they see themselves above the law. Critical theory. Critical theory upholds that the elite of society decide laws and the definition of crime. Those that commit crimes disagree with the laws that were created to keep control of them. This almost runs with conflict theory, although there's much more emphasis on the 1% controlling groups. Deterrence theory. This theory states that if a certain action carries a harsh punishment, individuals are less likely to commit said action. Differential association theory. This theory states that criminal behavior is learned through interactions with others, specifically intimate personal groups. Labeling theory. This theory states that an individual will become whatever he is labeled as, or what people expect him to become. Now, I'm going to use an example here that's really, really bad. You ever watch Zootopia? In it, there's a scene where, like, the fox guy says, if everyone's just going to see, like, a sly fox, then that's what I'm going to be. A horrible example, but I'm still using that to explain it. Life course theory. Okay, this theory is actually kind of confusing, so I'm going to try to break it down in a way that makes sense. You know those video games that are classified as like interactive movies? Basically, you'll watch it for 15 minutes and then there'll be a decision you have to make where it'll be like, do you want to go with your girlfriend to the mall for the super secret sex scene? Or do you hang out with your best friend who's super lonely and depressed? This theory states that life is a lot like these video games, where you only really have a few really big decisions to make that completely change the outcome of the game. But the rest of it is mostly you sitting back and watching life happen to you. Whether or not you will be a criminal greatly depends on what choices you make at these very big decisions. Now, of course, this theory is more complicated than that, but I would say this is one of the most complicated theories in this entire list, and I think that's the best way I can explain it. Political protection theory. Now, this theory can actually be broken up into 4 separate theories: queer, feminist, black, and Marxist. But it posits that certain actions or groups have been criminalized to protect this straight, white, capitalist patriarchy from losing control. Now, I think we can all come up with examples of this with the large part of Western society restricting the rights of women, non-white individuals, and queer people. Now, I, for one, completely disagree with the idea that communists should have any rights. As McCarthy once said, if you think they're a commie, lock them up. Psychoanalytical theory. To understand this theory fully, it really takes a pretty good grasp of what Freudian theories are. However, to break it down, this theory states that the unconscious mind, repressed memories, and trauma are the key drivers behind criminal and deviant behavior. Certain impulses such as repetition compulsion, which is the compulsion for individuals to repeat traumatic experiences, or death drive, which is the compulsion for individuals to die, I know you can figure that out yourself, can lead to self-destructive behavior and crime. Rational choice theory. This theory is thankfully way more simple than any other theories we're looking at. This pretty much just states that individuals think through a crime to decide if the benefit from committing that crime is worth the risk of punishment. Routine activity theory. This theory states that crime is inevitable, and if a target is attractive enough, crime will happen. Effective measures must be put in place to deter crime from happening. Social control theory. This theory is also pretty straightforward, with it saying that society has a responsibility to make the rules of itself clear, along with creating events to thwart criminal activity. As Joker once said, we live in a society that does not hold weekly tennis matches to thwart criminal activity. Social disorganization theory. This theory suggests that crime occurs in communities that experience breakdown on social institutions and communal bonds, such as highly populated, lower-income urban communities. This theory is very similar to anomaly theory, although I thought it was important to differentiate the two of them. Social learning theory. This theory suggests that individuals learn from those around them, and they base their morals and activities on what they see others in the society doing. If my brother and father are drug dealers and my sister shoplifts all the time, it's very likely that I also live a life of crime. You could argue this theory is very similar to differential association theory, but many criminologists still separate the two of them. Somatotype theory. This theory categorizes people into 3 different body types. Ectomorphs, which are the tall, skinny dudes. Mesomorphs, which are the average height, buff dudes. And then endomorphs, which are like the short, fat dudes. And it states that mesomorphs are the most likely to commit crime. It kind of sounds like a bunch of tall, skinny dudes and short, fat dudes got together and like, you know who we really hate? Those buff dudes that go to the gym all the time. I bet they're the most likely to commit crime. Strain theory. This theory states that individuals will turn to a life of crime when they are strained or when they are unable to achieve goals of society. For example, if I really wanted to be a comedian, but the only jokes I could come up with were like, why did the rope get coal in his stocking? Because he was naughty. I would probably be unable to achieve that goal and turn to a life of crime instead. Subcultural theory. This theory states that crime is due to lower-class individuals forming social circles with values that are greatly different from social norms. For example, like how gangs glorify drive-by shootings. Trait theory. This theory is almost another racist theory, although I think it has some kind of grounding, whereas the other ones kind of didn't. This states that individuals have certain traits that will contribute to whether or not they are capable of committing a crime when pushed in a certain direction, or when they're under duress. Traitor theory. This is the last theory, and it's really straightforward. It says that those that are brutalized by their parents or peers, especially in childhood, are very likely to commit violent crimes in adulthood. Oh, all right, we're done. That was 24 theories we just went through. That was a lot. But we can now continue into schools of thought. The school of thought one subscribes to greatly dictates what one believes the motivation behind a crime is, along with the punishment it deserves. There are 5 key perspectives I want to view for this part. The first is the demonic perspective. This view says that crime is caused by some form of demonic or evil possession that forced individuals to commit crime. If we're believing that crime is not the person's fault, right, they had no part in it, there was no free will choice, what do you think the punishment should be? Probably super lenient, right? Not like too harsh, because obviously the person didn't decide to do it. Wrong. Incorrect. The punishment is to be as brutal and severe as possible to please the gods and cleanse the community. For example, if you saw a woman doing arithmetic, she has clearly given herself over to Satan, and there's no choice but to burn her at the stake. Shockingly, this school of thought was largely abandoned as we enter the Renaissance, and there's not many criminological theories that surround it, because by the time the social theories began to develop, most people thought this was kind of dumb. I can't imagine why. The classical perspective is the one that took its place, and it argued that crime is a result of calculation of cost and reward. Thus, the punishment for it should be severe in order to deter thieves. For example, in a world where there is no punishment for an action, stealing bread would be very alluring, as you would receive only benefits and no detriments. Once a severe punishment has been set up for anyone that steals bread, people then must calculate if the rewarded bread is worth the risk of, being crucified, for example. Some theories that fall under this category is rational choice theory, routine activity theory, and deterrence theory. The next is the positivist perspective, which argues that crime is a result of biological, psychological, and sociological aspects that are out of the person's control. People are born criminals, not made into them, nor do they calculate the pros and cons of a crime to decide if they should do it. This view is similar to the demonic one, as both of them argue that individuals that commit crime don't really have free will, although they have a very, very different idea on how to punish individuals. This perspective strongly advocates for the use of rehabilitation, so criminals can be treated for whatever factors cause their behavior. There are several theories that fall under this school of thought, depending on which subcategory you subscribe to. Atavism, somatotype, and trait theory belong to biological positivism. Psychoanalytical theory belongs to psychological positivism, and anomy, differential association, and strain theory all belong to sociological positivism. Okay, for this next one, we're going to play a fun game. I want you to pay very close attention throughout my entire description of this next school of thought. At the end, I'm going to ask you a question to see if you can get it right. You ready? All right, let's begin. The Chicago School of Thought states criminal behavior is mostly due to social influence in the form of learned behavior, along with living in the chaotic zone of transition. This school of thought primarily focuses on crime in urban districts, and the Chicago School of Thought is much less concerned with retributive justice and punishment, and much more concerned with rehabilitation and reintegration, along with establishing restorative justice for all victims. Theories that fall under the school of thought are social disorganization, concentric zone, subcultural, and broken window theory. All right, are you ready? Because I'm about to ask you the question. Where was the Chicago School of Thought found? Was it A, New York City, B, Los Angeles, C, Chicago, or D, Tokyo? Yeah, it was Chicago. If you got that wrong, I'm concerned for you. Okay, one last school of thought, and then we can move on to the fun stuff. This is the social process school of thought. This school of thought states that it's society's responsibility to prevent crime. And whenever crime occurs, it's not the individual's fault, but instead society failing. This school strongly emphasizes the importance of societies to create opportunities, institutions, instill good morals, and avoid labeling minorities as dangerous to avoid crime from occurring. The punishment in this school of thought is really just rehabilitation, along with, reintegration, similar to Chicago School of Thought. Some theories that fall under the school of thought are labeling, social control, and social learning. While schools of thought and theories help us understand why crime happens in the general sense, I want to take this time to explore a very specific type of crime: multicide. Multicide is the crime of murdering multiple people, a portmanteau of multiple and homicide. This is perhaps the worst crime an individual can commit, which is why it's such an enthralling topic. We're going to explore the three most common types of multicide, those being serial killers, mass shooters, and terrorists. Before continuing, I want to define two terms. Well, once again, this time they're going to be the title of psychopath and sociopath. I'll be honest with you guys, I was really struggling to decide if I should include it or not. I had this section written out, and then I deleted it, and then I put it back, and it was really up in the air. The reason is because psychopath and sociopath aren't really medical terms or medical diagnosis, and there's a lot of debate on whether or not we should even use them. The reason I'm going to include them is because it seems very popular in the criminology field. A lot of people will explain serial killers or mass shooters as these psychopaths or sociopaths, and so I think it's kind of important to at least include this, but I do want you to remember that this is very much up for debate if this is like even a real thing. Psychopathy is thought to be a genetic trait. In other words, psychopaths are born, not made. It is characterized by a lack of guilt and empathy. Psychopaths often use feigned charisma to manipulate others into giving them what they want. Psychopaths are highly calculative and plan their actions out. This is contrasted by sociopaths, who are thought to be highly impulsive and erratic. Sociopathy is not genetic, but instead brought about by environmental factors, like trauma. What makes someone a serial killer? Well, this is actually a matter of great debate. There's tons of different definitions for what is a serial killer, but the one we're going to be using today is the FBI's. Their definition states that a serial killer is anyone that kills multiple individuals with at least a month or so between the murders, which separates them from spree killers. They're also primarily motivated by the desire to satisfy a psychological urge, separating them from contract killers. With this definition in place, let's explore the different types of serial killers, because while every single one is different, a lot of their motivations are similar. The first type is the power killer, who enjoys controlling and dominating their victim. They take great pleasure in the act of killing, first stalking their victim, then kidnapping and torturing them for prolonged periods of time until they finally kill their victim. This process is analogous to sex, with the foreplay of stalking their victim and the climax being when they kill them. In fact, sex is the perfect analogy, seeing how this control over another is often sexually stimulating to the killer. These killers often suffer from borderline personality disorder, afraid of rejection due to childhood abandonment. They like to violate their victims even after death, as it poses no risk of that person rejecting them. If I had to classify them, I would say these individuals are likely to be psychopaths. An example of a power killer would be John Wayne Gacy. I'm sure we all know him, Pogo the Clown. His method was to lure kids into his house, trick them into being handcuffed, and then he would proceed to rape and torture them until he slowly strangled them. So, overall, a pretty bad dude. Another type of serial killer is the notoriety killer. These individuals don't really enjoy the act of killing as much as they enjoy taunting the public. They are thrill seekers and enjoy the risk of getting caught. Many of them send letters to the police. These killers often suffer from narcissistic personality disorder and feel like the attention and recognition is owed to them. Once again, if I had to classify them, I would probably call them sociopaths due to their erratic behavior. Perhaps the most infamous notoriety killer was the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer portrayed a being that did not necessarily enjoy the act of killing, with a gun seeming to be his choice weapon, which many criminologists say is the easiest weapon to kill with, as it allows the perpetrator to distance themselves from the act. Out of the 7 attempted murders, only 5 were actually successful. It would seem that the Zodiac Killer would rather brag to the police about killing them than actually do it. This is a staple of a notoriety killer, as they simply want attention and see murders as a means to the end. Now, quickly, I just want to say, for every single one of these serial killers, I'll have linked in the description more information about them so you can read more on them. This guy, though, I really encourage you to, if you don't know anything about him, because he's, I kid you not, the biggest loser. Okay, I had a whole section where I talked about how, like, the letters he wrote to the police, where he says, like, ooh, I'm killing them so they'll be my slaves in the afterlife. The next type of killer is the psychosis killer. This type of killer believes that another entity has told them to kill. They are heavily detached from reality, with them hearing voices and holding delusionary beliefs. Can you guess which mental illness these serial killers suffer from? If you guess schizophrenia, you're absolutely correct. Some may point to the Son of Sam as an example of this type of killer, with him saying that his dog commanded him to kill, although I think a better one is Herbert Mullen. Mullen suffered from schizophrenia and believed that Americans would need to die as a blood sacrifice to hold off an earthquake, similar to the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Supposedly, his father had telepathically commanded him to kill for this reason. His first victim was Lawrence White, who telepathically invited Mullen to murder him, so others would live. Mullen then beat him to death with a baseball bat. He would continue to conduct murders like this, waiting for either his father to tell him to kill, or the victim to invite him to. In the end, Mullen killed about 13 people in the span of 4 months, allowing some debate on whether he's a serial killer or a spree killer. While some could argue that there are many more types of serial killers, I want to focus on only one more. I call this type of serial killer the mission killer. Mission killers are those that kill to rid the world of a specific group of people, with sex workers or queers being a popular target. Now, I want to interject right here to say that mass shooters and terrorists are the most common form of mission killers, although serial killers can be mission killers as well, as we'll see. Unfortunately, unlike the others, there's not really a discernible mental illness that causes this. A great example of this would be Joseph Franklin. After reading the book by Mein Kampf by you-know-who, he was inspired to start a race war. Now, kind of a lame idea, in my opinion, as Charles Manson already tried and failed to do this, but who am I to stand in the way of a delusional racist? Franklin would most often shoot and kill either Jews or interracial couples. In the end, he was responsible for the death of 8 individuals, and his dream of seeing a race war was never fulfilled. Now, while it would be really nice if every single serial killer fit into only one of these categories, in truth, most of them fit into multiple, even maybe a couple that I covered. And like I said before, there are even more types of killers, with some splitting, I think, power killers into control killers and hedonistic killers. I don't personally agree with it, but I just want to let you know. With that, let's start into the next section. This category is going to be dedicated to understanding the different profiles for mass shooters. Now, I understand that mass shooters is technically a subcategory of like mass murder or spree killers, although I live in America, so everybody's a mass shooter. There don't really exist like mass stabbings here. The Department of Justice have identified 4 key characteristics found in almost every single mass shooter. The first being childhood trauma, which makes a lot of sense. The second is a crisis point, or in other words, some kind of trigger like being bullied or their partner leaving them. The third is seeking justification for their actions, often by reading on other mass shooters for affirmation. And finally, perhaps the most obvious, is obtaining a gun either legally or illegally. Now, before we get into the profiles of the different mass shooters, I want to explain that I won't be using any mass shooter's real name. This is because a lot of them want to be notorious, want to be infamous, want to be remembered, and I personally don't think they deserve that, so I'll just be referring to them with Greek letters. There are 4 profiles of mass shooters that criminologists have formed. They do this by examining the location of a shooting and seeing what all the shooters have in common. The first profile is probably the most infamous, the school shooter, or K-12 shooter. These individuals are either a current student or former student of the school. They have extensive history of trauma and deal with suicidal ideations. Typically, they will plan out the shooting to an obsessive extent, and they have a weird urge to brag to others about it. They usually obtain the firearm by stealing it from a family member, and the motivation for it, I don't want to start reading the lyrics to Exception by Token, but the motivation for the shooting is usually either bullying or some kind of harassment. An example of this profile can be found in the Columbine shooting. 2 individuals, we'll call them Gamma and Delta, were enrolled in the high school and were responsible for the deaths of 13 people. Both shooters seemed to suffer from suicidal thoughts and planned the attack out for a year, with them constantly posting about it online. They acquired the guns illegally from a friend of theirs. In Gamma's writings, he recorded several reasons for his attack, including revenge against supposed bullies and his desire for notoriety. The next profile is the college shooter. Once again, these shooters usually attend or did attend the college of the shooting. These individuals also have a history of suicide and childhood trauma, although interestingly, aggressive behavior and violence is also very common in these individuals. This type of shooter will often write a manifesto to explain their motivations for the shooting, and because they are of age, most of them just buy the gun legally. A reoccurring motivation for these individuals is isolation and loneliness, and a profile that fits this is the shooter at Virginia Tech. With 32 victims, Virginia Tech ranks the 3rd deadliest shooting in America. The shooter, Epsilon, was enrolled in the college and matched the history of trauma and other mental illnesses shooters often have. He heavily planned the attack, although he did not specifically brag about it. In his manifesto, Epsilon states that his motivation was to take revenge on society that had marginalized and isolated him, along with his desire to be remembered. The third profile is the workplace shooter, which are shootings at a place of business, usually where the shooter is employed. Interestingly, there does not seem to be a strong correlation between mental illness and these shooters. Instead, they're usually triggered by some kind of crisis event, and they're almost never planned out or bragged about. The most common location for these types of shootings is at some kind of blue-collar job site, where the shooter uses an assault rifle. The gun is almost always legally obtained, and the motivation for the shooting is a lot of times workplace conflict. An example of this profile can be found at the Virginia Beach shooting. 12 human lives were taken that day at a municipal building where Theta worked at. The attack seemed to be spontaneous, with Theta writing a very cool and collected letter of resignation through email just hours beforehand. It did not seem like Theta had any mental illnesses, so finding the motivation for this shooting is really difficult. The leading theory right now is that there is some kind of conflict with a fellow coworker, as there were some slight reports that he didn't get along with them, although even that isn't very convincing. To me, this is the scariest type of shooting, as there are no real warning signs that it will happen, and it's not really clear how we can combat this. Finally, we have commercial shooters. These individuals pick public spaces, like stores or restaurants, to vent their frustrations. Interestingly, these shooters are often depressed or schizophrenic, and their delusional thoughts often lead them to commit these horrible acts. Now, for example, rather than look at a shooter that really wanted notoriety or just had no real motivation that we could discern, I wanted to dip our toes a little bit into radical ideology. Now, for this entire section, I wanted to stay away from mission killers, as I feel like there's a big difference between shooting a place because you're mad at the people there and shooting up a place for some political or religious aim. Now, the shooter we're going to look at for this example is slightly more terrorist adjacent, although I do believe his motivations were purely personal grievance and had nothing to do with, like, radical ideology. The Isla Vista killings, done by who we will appropriately call Beta, and you'll see why later, resulted in the death of 6 individuals. Beta did not seem to specifically plan the attack out, with him attacking his roommates and then a nearby sorority. But he does have a lengthy manifesto, which I unfortunately read a long time ago. I regret that more than anything. But in it, let me give you the plot points. He rants on and on about how much he hates women because they won't have sex with him, and then men that women do have sex with. Now, you might hear this and think, wow, this guy kind of sounds like an incel. Yup. You got it. His attack was primarily motivated to punish those that could do what he could not, which I guess was just get a girlfriend. I don't know. All right, we are now on to the final section. Terrorists. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines terrorist as a practitioner of terrorism. Okay, that's not helpful. But let's try Urban Dictionary. Urban Dictionary defines terrorist as George W. Bush. Okay, these not helping a lot. Let's go to the old reliable Wikipedia. Wikipedia defines terrorist as any individual that uses violence against civilians to push forth a political or religious aim. Now, originally, I was going to explain these different religious or political goals, but the more I thought about it and the more I researched, the more I realized that a lot of these are like guerrilla warfare tactics, like in Vietnam, and we're still in the criminal etiology section, so it kind of felt weird to dip into geopolitics instead. I really just want to look at the individual's motivation to become a terrorist, and to do this, we're going to look at criminological theories on, wait, no, not again! Yeah, that's right. We're back. But this time, good news, we only have 3 theories to go over rather than 24. So we're going to just go through this as fast as possible, and then we can get on with our day. Identity theory. This theory states that many young people become terrorists in their search for identity, as they desire to become something bigger than themselves. Revenge theory. Revenge theory states that when an individual feels the group they have been a part of has been disrespected or humiliated, it drives them to take revenge on the opposing group by striking fear through terrorism. Group socialization theory. This theory states that many individuals join terrorist organizations to spend time with one of their members. This is probably like the funniest theory to me. Imagine being like, oh, my crush Jessica is a part of ISIS. Maybe I should join. All right, guys, and now we're done with the... Hold up, I'm getting a phone call.
Theo, the first time you did it, it felt ironic, but now it just feels lazy.
No, I swear, it's still satire, okay? Please believe me. All right, this section I'm going to be really, really nice to you. I'm not even going to ask you what penology means. I'm just going to tell you. Penology is the study of punishment. The subfield is concerned with the proper response to crime, with it wanting to repress crime, but also not mistreat criminals. The Code of Hammurbi is perhaps the most influential text in the entire field of penology, as it established the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. It is these two almost conflicting ideas to deter criminals, but also treat them well, that makes penology such a fascinating study. For example, if I simply wanted to deter crime, all I would do is cut off the hands of anyone that steals. But because I recognize that criminals are human beings like me, I see that they deserve a chance for redemption. Penology examines the history of punishment to measure its effectiveness, along with how it can be reformed or refined. For example, flogging criminals is a very common practice throughout the world, although many criminologists now see this as cruel and ineffective. Because of this, many societies have pivoted to other forms of punishment. Another one I can think of is fines, which is pretty much you pay money to either the state or the victim, although even this is pretty ineffective. To explain why this is, I'm going to use the old quote, if the punishment for a crime is a fine, then the law only exists for the lower class. Yeah, I did just quote Final Fantasy. What are you going to do about it? This leads us to the most common form of punishment, which is prison. This is because it has the capability of performing the 4 key aspects that penology identifies as important. The first aspect is often stated to be retributive justice, as immoral actions is thought to deserve a proportional punishment. The second, which is stated in the classical school of thought, is deterrence. This can almost be combined with retributive justice and deterrence, as I kind of view them as the same, but many criminologists separate the two, and so I'll be doing the same. Deterrence allows individuals to recognize beforehand why they should avoid crime, whereas retributive justice is more post facto correction. Another purpose of prison is to protect the public. Crimes classified as violent or destructive often hold longer sentences because of the threat they pose to the citizens. Separating these dangerous individuals from those that they could potentially harm is important to keep the innocent safe. Of course, we would much rather not keep criminals in prison forever, which is why the fourth reason, rehabilitation, is so important. Before finishing this section, there's one last punishment I want to talk about. I skipped over this in the previous section on punishments that suck and don't work because even though I might think that, there's still great debate in the criminologist sphere about whether or not we should use this. Now, I don't really want to ramble on and on and on about how I think the death penalty is bad and we shouldn't use it. So instead, I put 2 videos in the description, one for the death penalty and one against it, and I advise you watch both of them. Maybe one day I'll talk more about it in a separate video. Now, to finalize this section, I want to say that despite the disagreement on whether or not we should use it, both sides seem to agree that if we do use the death penalty, it should be as painless as possible. Because of this, as time goes on, we've changed the method of sentencing from crucifixion to hanging to firing squad, and the most common nowadays is lethal injection. So, yeah, that's criminology. I hope you learned something, because if you didn't, I am so sorry. To make my English professor and H-bomber guy happy, I put all my citations in the description. I recommend you check those out, along with the Learn More section. For every single section I covered, I put like some other videos and some other articles you could read if you want to know more about them. I really enjoy making these videos, taking any subject and trying to condense it all down into an hour in length. The research is so fun to me. The editing is not. I hate that, but I hope you like the end product. I'll probably be making more of these videos on different subjects, so let me know if there's any particular subject you want me to cover. Until then, according to the essay format, I'm supposed to have a call to action at the end, so here's mine. Don't do crime. It's bad. Cue the outro music.